The musty scent of aged paper still clung to her hands, even after I'd washed them. It was a smell that promised secrets, and this letter, tucked away in a shoebox under a loose floorboard in her attic, delivered. It wasn't addressed to me, but to someone I barely knew, someone my parents rarely mentioned, a phantom in the periphery of my childhood memories. The paper, brittle and yellowed, felt impossibly delicate as I unfolded it, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs, a sensation I'd grown accustomed to during moments of unexpected discovery. The words weren't just ink on a page, they were a confession, a brutal unraveling of years of silence that had shaped my entire existence, a silence so profound it had become a character in its own right. For as long as I could remember, there had been a void. Not a literal one, but a palpable absence of my parents during crucial junctures of my childhood. Summers were spent with relatives I felt no deep connection to, cousins I barely recognized and aunts and uncles whose smiles felt polite rather than welcoming. Holidays were marked by their distant phone calls, the tinny sound of their voices crackling through the receiver, and milestones were celebrated with blurry photos, slightly out of focus, and rushed visits that felt more like obligations fulfilled than genuine moments of connection. The explanations were always vague, delivered with a practiced weariness. Work, distance, unforeseen circumstances. I learned to internalize this absence, to build walls around the hurt, telling myself it was normal, that other kids experienced it too, a mantra I repeated silently to myself whenever the pang of loneliness struck. But deep down a persistent question gnawed, a persistent itch that could never be scratched. Why? Why were they so often absent from my life, while seemingly present and involved in everyone else's? The carefully curated narratives of my friends' lives, filled with parental outings and shared adventures, only amplified this gnawing question. My grandmother, bless her soul, was a woman of quiet strength and fierce loyalty. She passed away a few years ago, leaving behind a house overflowing with memories, the scent of lavender and old polish, and a profound stillness. It was during a reluctant clearing out of her attic, a task I'd been dreading, a bittersweet journey through a life lived, that I stumbled upon that shoebox. I was looking for old photo albums, hoping to piece together a more coherent picture of my family history, to find visual evidence of the people who were supposed to be my anchors. My fingers, dusted with the fine powder of forgotten things, brushed against the worn cardboard. Inside, nestled amongst faded birth certificates and pressed, forgotten flowers, lay the letter, a tangible piece of a hidden past. It was from my mother, written many years ago to my aunt, her sister, a woman I knew primarily through whispered family lore and a few awkward holiday encounters. The handwriting, so familiar from birthday cards and grocery lists, yet so alien on this aged paper, flowed with an urgency that immediately captured my attention, a frantic energy that belied the calm facade she usually maintained. It spoke of a difficult decision, a profound sacrifice, a solemn pact. The tone wasn't one of regret, not a hint of self-pity, but of grim determination, a mother justifying a choice that clearly weighed heavily on her, a burden she carried with stoic resolve, but one she believed was absolutely necessary for the greater good. She wrote about the constant pressure, the subtle manipulations that had woven themselves into the fabric of their lives. My father, a man of considerable ambition and a shrewd negotiator in his professional life, had always been deeply enmeshed in family obligations, a tangled web of familial expectations. But these weren't just typical family visits or pleasantries. These were demands, veiled threats disguised as requests, issued by his parents. They were wealthy, influential, and accustomed to getting their way, their wishes shaping the lives of those around them like clay. My grandmother's letter, I now understood, was a response to this suffocating pressure, a desperate attempt to protect her own peace, her own children, from the suffocating grip of her formidable in-laws. My parents, it seemed, had been playing a long game, a complex chess match where I, the child, was the unwitting pawn. My grandmother's letter explained in excruciating detail how my father's parents had essentially dictated terms, laying down non-negotiable conditions for their involvement in their son's life. They wanted a certain lifestyle, a certain image to project to the world, and they believed that this image included having their grandchildren readily available, to mold, to impress, to showcase as trophies of their success. My mother, a gentle soul who chafed under their authoritarian rule, who felt her spirit crushed by their every pronouncement, had been systematically worn down, her resilience eroding with each passing day. The letter described late-night arguments that had echoed through the silent house, tearful pleas that went unanswered, and a growing, suffocating sense of entrapment. The breaking point, according to the letter, was when my paternal grandparents proposed a rather significant financial arrangement. It wasn't a bribe, not in the conventional sense, but a structured support system for my parents, a lifeline of financial security, contingent on their children, specifically me, their firstborn, their legacy, spending a substantial amount of time under their roof, essentially being raised by them, shaped by their hands. The idea was to instill the family values, to ensure I would be a proper heir to their legacy, a continuation of their esteemed lineage. My mother was horrified, her maternal instincts recoiling at the thought. She envisioned a life where her child was a mere extension of her in-laws' will, a puppet dancing on their strings, a pawn in their grand self-serving design. The letter revealed my parents' counter-proposal, a desperate maneuver born of a complex mix of love and fear. They would agree to significant financial assistance, a lifeline that would provide them with security and freedom from their parents' constant interference, but on one crucial condition: they would keep me away. They would create a life for themselves, separate from the constant scrutiny and demands, a life where they could breathe freely, and in doing so they believed they would be sparing me from being indoctrinated into a world that felt stifling and transactional, a world that valued appearances over genuine affection. They convinced themselves that my grandparents' influence, their rigid values, their possessive approach, would be detrimental to my spirit, my individuality, the very essence of who I was meant to be. So they chose absence. They chose to let me be raised by others, to build a life where they could be truly free, and in their minds free to be better parents when they could see me, when they had the time and emotional space to truly connect. The impact of this realization was profound, a seismic shift that shook the very foundations of my understanding. It wasn't just about a childhood devoid of consistent parental presence, a quiet ache that had always been there. It was about a deliberate choice made by people I loved, a choice that prioritized their freedom and perceived protection of me over their actual day-to-day involvement in my life. The narrative I had painstakingly constructed for myself, that they were busy, that they loved me from afar, that this was just how life was, crumbled into dust. They hadn't just been absent, they had actively chosen to be absent, as a means of escape from an oppressive situation and paradoxically as a form of safeguarding, a desperate act of parental love disguised as abandonment. For weeks I wrestled with this new understanding, the words of the letter replaying in my mind like a broken record. The anger simmered, a slow burn that threatened to consume me, to warp my perception of everything I had ever known. I replayed memories, seeing them through a distorted lens, searching for confirmation of my grandmother's words, for the subtle signs of my parents' strategic withdrawal, the carefully orchestrated distances. It was painful, this reevaluation of my entire past, like looking at old photographs and seeing not happy memories but staged performances. I felt like a stranger in my own history, a misplaced character in a story I thought I understood. Then a quiet resolve began to form, a slow, steady ember in the ashes of my anger. Revenge, in the conventional sense, felt hollow, a futile pursuit that would only perpetuate the cycle of pain. What would it achieve? To confront them now, after all these years, to shatter the fragile peace they had so painstakingly built, to unleash the unspoken truths that had festered in the silence? No. The true justice, I realized, lay not in retribution, but in reclaiming my own narrative, in living my life on my own terms, unburdened by the weight of their past choices, the ghosts of their decisions. It was about finding my own path, independent of the shadows they had cast. The opportunity presented itself during a rare family gathering, a significant birthday celebration for my father's eldest sibling, a milestone that brought most of the estranged branches of the family together. My parents were there as always, playing their roles with practiced ease, engaging in polite conversation, their smiles tight, their eyes darting around the room. The air was thick with unspoken history, a palpable tension that hung in the air like a storm cloud. As the evening wore on, and after a few drinks had loosened tongues, the carefully constructed politeness began to fray at the edges. My aunt, the recipient of my grandmother's letter, the keeper of the secret, caught my eye across the crowded room. There was a shared understanding, a knowing glance that bypassed words, a silent acknowledgement of the unspoken truth that had bound us together for years. Later, when the crowd had thinned, the conversations had dwindled to murmured goodnights, and the celebratory din had subsided, I found myself standing near my father, the usual pleasantries hanging in the air, an invisible barrier between us, a chasm of unacknowledged emotions. I took a deep breath, the musty scent of my grandmother's letter still a phantom memory, a whisper of the past that lingered on my skin. I didn't raise my voice, didn't accuse, didn't demand. I simply stated calmly, my voice steady despite the tremor within. I found Grandma's letter. His smile faltered, a sudden jarring crack in his composed facade. The color drained from his face, leaving behind a mask of startled apprehension, a look of a cornered animal. He opened his mouth to speak, to form a denial, an explanation, anything, but no sound emerged. My mother across the room had frozen mid-gesture, her eyes wide with alarm, a silent scream caught in her throat. The carefully constructed facade of their lives, the illusion of normalcy they had maintained for so long, suddenly seemed incredibly fragile, as if it might shatter at any moment. I didn't elaborate. I didn't offer details, didn't demand explanations, didn't want to dissect the pain further. I just met his gaze, a steady, unwavering look that conveyed everything he needed to know. I understood. The years of silence, the carefully guarded truth, the sacrifices and the compromises, had been exposed not by a dramatic revelation, but by a quiet admission, a simple statement of fact. The carefully constructed dam had been breached. The rest of the evening passed in an almost surreal silence for me, a profound quietness amidst the hushed goodbyes and lingering goodnights. My parents were visibly uncomfortable, their conversation strained, their attention often drifting towards me, their eyes tracking my movements with a new, wary awareness. The easy familiarity they projected with other relatives seemed to dissipate whenever they were in my vicinity, replaced by a palpable awkwardness, a hesitating distance. It was a subtle shift, a ripple effect of unease that spread through the room like a silent tremor. They didn't lash out, didn't try to deny, didn't attempt to rewrite history in the moment. The weight of their past decision, laid bare by a simple discovery, had settled upon them, a burden they could no longer carry in secret. Over the following months, the dynamic of our relationship shifted, a gradual, almost imperceptible alteration. My parents, while not overtly apologetic, their actions not marked by grand gestures of remorse, became more attentive. Their calls became more frequent, their visits more planned and sincere, devoid of the old, rushed feeling. The old excuses, the well-worn narratives of busyness and distance, were no longer trotted out. They seemed to be operating under a new awareness, a quiet understanding that their past choices had consequences, not just for them, but for the person they had kept at a distance, the person they had sacrificed for. They seemed to be trying to bridge the gap, to build a new connection on the ruins of the old. There was no grand reconciliation, no cathartic outpouring of emotion, no dramatic scene where all was forgiven and forgotten. The damage, the years of absence, the emotional void, could not be erased with a simple acknowledgement. But there was a new foundation, built on a hard-won truth, a foundation of honesty, however somber it might be. They had to live with the knowledge that I knew. I knew the sacrifices they had made, and I knew the cost of those sacrifices. My quiet action hadn't destroyed them, hadn't shattered their world, but it had irrevocably altered the landscape of our relationship, forcing a gentle, undeniable reckoning, a quiet acknowledgement of the past. The silence that had defined our connection had been broken, and in its place a more honest, albeit more somber, connection began to take root, a tentative seedling pushing through the hard soil of unspoken truths.